Hey, Joseph. Any interesting cases in the news lately?
I heard something about an interesting corporate injunction. Oh, you mean like interesting?
Interesting.
Well, so some people have requested us in some way to reflect on differences with the U.S. criminal justice system versus the Canadian justice system to try and do some commentary on the Sean Combs trial in the United States.
Otherwise known as P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, PD, a.k.a. Love. Apparently that's one of his names as well.
That's fine. I mean, so we're gonna try and not comment much on sort of evidentiary issues. There's a lot of evidence, as you said, Diana, still to come. Like it's just at the early stages.
We're recording this just so it's going to be published or go online after. So more evidence is going to come out at trial by the time we're recording our statements. Our focus is not on specifically the evidence that's come out so far, mostly related to domestic violence, but we want to look at what the Crown needs, the prosecutors, as it is in the States.
You're so Canadian.
It's all about...
How about?
It's all about about what's involved in proving racketeering, I think.
Well, let's just start from the beginning. So he's charged with, let me just summarize, 5 counts, including 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking, 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, and then I think domestic assault allegations regarding his former partner of 11 years. Yeah. Right? That's Miss Ventura.
And there's significant evidence, and that's mainly where the Crown, the prosecutors have started.
It's hard, I know, because it's what we talk about all the time.
Started their case, is focusing on what is, there's significant evidence of domestic violence, including a video that everybody's aware of, I think most people are aware of, in which he was recorded at a hotel, the Intercontinental, kicking...
The Continental? Like in John Wick?
Intercontinental, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to be a little silly during this one. I apologize.
Where there's some video from the hotel footage in the hallway where the complainant in that case, his partner, I'm trying to remember her name right now, I have it written down, Cassie Ventura, was, it was recorded that he grabbed her by the hoodie, kicked her while she was on the ground, and then dragged her by the hair. That's pretty significant and very emotive in terms of domestic violence charges.
Yeah, and I got to be honest.
It's not proof of racketeering.
It's not proof of... Okay, so I'm not 100% clear on exactly what count he's facing for the domestic violence versus a count of using her as part of sex trafficking. And the reason for this is the complicated way, with respect, and I apologize to my U.S. counterparts, about how they go about cases in the United States. So in this case, there is an indictment. We have indictments in Canada. They have indictments in the United States. But unlike our indictments, which lay out the actual charges...
Factual-based as opposed to narrative-based.
It's very factual. An account will be like 3-4 lines, maybe 5 or 6. That's it. It says it's a sex assault, it's a domestic assault, it's a harassment, it's a trafficking, contrary to such and such section, according to this time frame, jurisdiction. Yeah. That's all it is. The indictments in the United States are a literal narrative.
Like a factum.
Worse, it's a literal narrative. Factums are easy to read. Yeah. It's a literal narrative of the actual prosecution case. So, with respect, it's sometimes not completely clear. It's written as a narrative persuasive document as opposed to simply just counts of charges. And with that, it becomes somewhat, in my ability to assess this as a Canadian lawyer, having done been inferentially connected to some U.S. cases, it's a little difficult to follow.
So one of the key aspects that I see in this, and of course I'm not a lawyer, so that's why I rely on you and much more experience, especially with racketeering charges, but it's a key component in the way this is laid out, that he had a business. Well, it's common for people to have businesses. Just the fact that you have a business doesn't make it a racketeering operation.
Well, yeah. So he's alleged to have been involved. What they say is basically there's 2 sides to Mr. Combs. One who was the cultural, as they call him, icon or artist. The other who was one who ran a criminal enterprise. So that's where the racketeering conspiracy comes in, under the RICO Act in the United States. And that's essentially an enterprise, a criminal enterprise, or as we have it here in Canada, criminal organization. But they have it as he ran a criminal enterprise with an inner circle of people who helped him commit crimes and cover them up. And this included issues involving his former girlfriend, Miss Ventura, to have sex with male escorts, filmed and recorded, and then used as blackmail. Resources for business ventures used to sexually exploit multiple women. These freak-offs, which were multi-day events allegedly
That's a big
orchestrated.
term. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll deal with that more later.
Big sex fest, frankly, on multi-day events that Combs allegedly orchestrated, where women, including Ventura, were allegedly drugged and forced into unwanted sex acts. And much of their case will focus on Ventura and another victim who's going to be used, identified as a pseudonym, during the trial to support these allegations.
Alleged victim.
Alleged victim. Sorry about that. So he's alleged to have been involved in a criminal enterprise. That is really the core of the prosecution case in the United States.
Well, right off the top, though, they're alleging that among other crimes, there was sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice.
That's right. All part of this criminal enterprise.
So these are factors. Once they put it into the case, these are factors that they need to show and prove in court.
Okay, so let me try and break it down. But just, we know sort of how the prosecution will go about their case, calling Miss Ventura, calling another witness, and calling a number of witnesses who will establish that the unwanted sex went on, that was not consented to, that was coerced as part of this enterprise, and is going to call these witnesses. The defense, in their opening statement, we don't have the full transcript of it, we just have tidbits, clearly conceded that there was domestic violence involving Ventura, correctly, because it's all on video.
Yeah.
But that's not sex trafficking.
Right. And so that's an important thing to pause on, though, is that as much as you may feel sympathy for the complainant, Ventura,
and she's clearly a victim of domestic violence.
Yeah, and it's not just a matter of, was she, staying with him in order to advance her career, therefore it's her own choice. No, you can't agree to be beaten like she was on video being beaten. So leading with this evidence is obviously going to create sympathy for...
It's powerful evidence to lead off with.
To lead off with. But that's very different. Domestic violence is very different than racketeering.
Right. And then, again, the racketeering is a term in the United States that we may want to just for future, if we're going to follow this, to stay away from to some extent, because it's I prefer to use criminal enterprise, essentially for human trafficking. That's the core of it. So let me just go through this for these Canadian viewers. I just want
to point out, while we're at that point, that in the wording at paragraph 3 of the indictment, they say that Diddy engaged in persistent and pervasive pattern of abuse toward women and other individuals. That's really broad in terms of language.
Yeah. So again, this is why I find these indictments sometimes overly complex, overly narrative, and I think written in a way that it shows that the U.S. system, frankly, is designed to crush. I'm sorry. Because this is a persuasive document. Yeah. An indictment should really be just a statement of
technical.
Yes. And that's the way they do it in the U.S.
Additionally, in that same paragraph, they say highly orchestrated performances of sexual activity with male commercial sex workers.
Right.
And this stands out to me, and this is an interesting point that I think that the prosecutors have to deal with, is that they're talking about sex workers that were employed by Diddy, but not coerced by Diddy to engage in prostitution. These were pre-existing sex workers.
Who were paid to attend.
And they were male sex workers
right.
paid to attend a party with a bunch of females.
Right.
And there's...
But as part of this indictment, there's other people who are involved who attended these freak-offs, and part of the allegations is that these victims, these alleged victims, these complainants, not sure how many... were forced and coerced into these sex acts, not just with these male escorts. But
one more point before you go forward.
okay.
They also talk about him obtaining and distributing narcotics. And some of the narcotics have been named, like MDMA and ketamine. Ketamine is more nefarious in nature because it's like a tranquilizer kind of drug. But also ketamine has become, like GHB used to be considered a rape drug. People recreationally take GHB, and ketamine is also a recreational drug now.
Yeah.
So providing those drugs
It's very
to people
common
who want it
That's right.
is different than surreptitiously drugging people.
Right. So let's just focus for a moment, because one of the questions we had is, what do these RICO charges mean? Is it similar to what we have in Canada? So it is to some extent. We do have similar racketeering charges, but you'll never hear about it much in Canada, okay? We deal with just criminal organizations under the criminal code. So in the United States, to successfully prosecute a RICO statute offense, that's a racketeering offense, you have to establish a few things. The prosecution must demonstrate the existence of an enterprise, its impact on interstate commerce, and the defendant's association with that enterprise.
And the enterprise has to be not just a business, but has to be an enterprise engaged in certain types of activities.
Predominantly criminal. So they must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the enterprise existed, that the enterprise affected interstate commerce, that the defendant was associated or employed by the enterprise, that the defendant engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity, which is criminal activity, and 5, the defendant conducted or participated in the conduct of the enterprise through that pattern of racketeering activity through the commission of at least 2 acts of racketeering activity as set forth in the indictment. The enterprise is defined as including any individual, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity, and any union or group of individuals associated, in fact, although not a legal entity. And there's a pattern of racketeering activity that says there can be a requirement of any 2 acts, so at least 2 acts, of activity within 10 years of each other. So the government, it's more broadly defined and a more flexible concept in order to be able to prosecute these racketeering offenses. The government must show that the racketeering predicates are related and that they amount to or pose a threat of continued criminal activity. So it's a bit complex in the United States, but let's take it simple.
So, the acts that are alleged, they don't have to prove all of them in order to succeed. They just have to prove some of them, right? So they specifically say that P. Diddy's companies and organization attempted to engage in, or did engage in, among other activities, sex trafficking,
Right.
forced labor.
Right.
So that means, somebody's made to work for you when they didn't want to.
Yeah, so you can have human trafficking and forced labor, leaving aside the Sex Act, but yes.
Interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution. So this is interesting because it seems that they're talking about people engaged in the act of prostitution, the profession of prostitution, who were then transported out of one state into another.
Correct.
So that they're then saying because they crossed a state borderline, this now escalates it, right? Coercion and enticement to engage in prostitution. So that's different than just hiring a prostitute. That's saying that you're actually convincing somebody to engage in an act of prostitution, which they wouldn't have otherwise done.
Correct.
Right? Narcotics offenses. So that's not just possession necessarily, but for selling it, or not just simple possession. Kidnapping. That's a serious charge. We haven't heard evidence on yet.
No, it was
Presumably it's
case is just at the beginning now.
But that could include just somebody saying that they wanted to leave but weren't allowed to. Or it could be somebody being physically taken. We don't know yet. Arson, that's an intriguing one, because there has been some stuff in the news about him exploding somebody's car. Bribery, that can be a bunch of stuff. And, not as difficult a charge to say. It was like, no, somebody wanted money. When you're a billionaire, people want money from you. So we'll see what they have on that. And obstruction of justice. So that means that they actively interfered with an investigation.
This episode is sponsored by EasyDNS. EasyDNS is a domain name, registrar, and host that has a 30-year track record in the domain and web hosting industry. Whether it be cancel culture, platform attacks, or nefarious actors online, move your domain and web hosting over to EasyDNS, one of the most secure web hosting services, and help support Not on Record in the process. All you have to do is go to easydns.com/notonrecord, or when you sign up at EasyDNS, use the promo code NOTONRECORD at checkout. Thank you, EasyDNS, for your support of Not on Record. And now back to our podcast. Thank you. Again, just for the people who ask these questions of us, so the 𝐶ombs enterprise involves his legitimate business, but engaged in furthering a criminal activity. And again, the nub of this is that 𝐶ombs and other members and associates of his enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Mr. 𝐶ombs to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into 𝐶ombs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship.
Presumably some male victims as well.
Yep, I'm just reading from actual what they're proffering as evidence. 𝐶ombs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that he referred to as these freak-offs. They were elaborate and produced sexual performances arranged, directed by him, for which he derived sexual pleasure from, and were electronically recorded.
We should actually describe, because you used the term freak-offs a couple of times. This is a key element of the charges and the evidence that's come out so far, and a lot of it relates to these things called freak-offs, which is a number of individuals invited to events that involved sexual activity and were apparently called freak-offs, which was days-long drug-fueled events.
Sex events.
In which some people may have voluntarily gone, but other people claim that they were forced to participate in.
Right. And that in arranging these freak-offs, or these sexual, prolonged, drug-fueled events, 𝐶ombs, with the assistance of members and associates of the 𝐶ombs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. These freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, often involved multiple commercial sex workers. During these, he distributed a variety of controlled substances, as you noted, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, he kept videos and he filmed these victims engaging in sex acts with commercial workers. After these freak-offs, 𝐶ombs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. And then members of his enterprise, including high-ranking supervisors, etc., all were used by him to assist in not only facilitating these acts, but then maintaining control and covering them up.
So that's an important aspect in terms of the racketeering charges. So, it's outlined here too that individuals employed by him through his business are alleged to have partaken in covering up these things. Security staff, household staff, personal assistants, high-ranking supervisors, and close associates that are alleged to have engaged in covering the acts up and assisting in illegal activities.
And the prosecution will proffer evidence to support that 𝐶ombs subjected these victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse to cause the victims to engage in these freak-off events. 𝐶ombs maintained control over his victims through, among other things, physical violence, promise of career opportunities, granting and threatening to withhold financial support, and by other coercive means, including tracking their whereabouts, dictating the victim's appearance, monitoring their medical records, controlling their housing, and supplying them with controlled substances. On and on and on.
I got to say, aside from the physical violence, when you work in the entertainment industry, a lot of those things are just kind of par for the course. People want to get a job and want to get ahead in business, so they make their own decisions about who they want to engage with. It doesn't mean that just because he was more powerful, that his power somehow forced them to do that. That's one of the challenges, I think, that faces the Crown is...
It's not the Crown, it's the prosecution.
I think
they've overcome that already. So you've got Ventura as a witness. So this is where we can draw this in.
Yeah, okay.
So she is a partner of 11 years who's given clear testimony of her own being subjected to physical violence, which we know and is admitting to. She's testified to being involved in these freak-off events where she's forced to have sex with sex workers. She has
clearly beaten when she's
clearly beaten and coerced and controlled both physically, psychologically, and financially and otherwise. So that evidence, when you just simply look at it from the perspective of, yes, there's domestic violence here that's clear and admitted, it goes way beyond that, because this evidence now is a overall matrix of evidence supporting the core of the prosecution's case. It is describing exactly what one victim would be part of these freak-offs and what they would have to do. And they also prosecution called last week, a sex worker who testified about being paid to attend and do a number of acts with Miss Ventura. So they're locking that up fairly well. You know, there's been cross-examination. I didn't follow. There was a break in evidence because there was some legal argument, but there was cross-examination, I think, of that male sex worker. But the core of their evidence, really right at the front end, has established the coercive, violent, controlling narrative that would support the sex trafficking and enterprise aspects of their case.
And that the purpose, as alleged, is that that Combs was actually present and getting sexual gratification from coercing these acts.
Yeah. So in order to sort of try and deal with this, he's pled, of course, not guilty and is presumed innocent until the jury decides otherwise, is that, you know, his core has to be with Ventura. She's obviously fabricating or lying, possibly due to her anger at how he mistreated her, and that whatever acts she describes, if that's the way they're really going down, is that, you know, she was voluntarily participating. And any person who attended these freak-offs, the core of what, again, I keep saying this, but what the prosecution has to overcome is, were these coerced or were these voluntary? Did these people consent to enter any, That's
what I'm saying. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Ventura was being physically abused, but the question is, was everybody else, you know?
The problem is when you start off with somebody with video evidence, clearly there's violent abuse and control and domination of this particular person. And then that person goes on to describe evidence that fits with the prosecution narrative. It's hard to overcome that because you have this video that stands out. It is highly prejudicial to the defense. Highly, highly prejudicial. And then you have evidence of this sex worker who testifies. And there's a lot more of this to come.
Yeah, like by the time this comes out, there'll be even more evidence out there. But, you know, I did find it interesting, like, you know, they're saying that this coercion was advanced through violence, use of firearms, threats of violence, coercion, and verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Again, they're going to have to prove that that was not just part of domestic violence, but part of an organizational routine. And use of firearms, what I've seen so far is possession of firearms, which in the States is legal.
Yeah, but that's, yeah.
Just the fact that somebody carries a gun around doesn't mean that they're breaking the law.
No, but it's the circumstances in which it's the constellation of factors. They're brandishing or carrying a weapon on them and exerting psychological control over somebody. That weapon then takes on a nefarious role. Yeah. It's no longer just used for...
I mean, the point here is just to, you know, what we're trying to do is look at what the prosecutor has to prove, right?
Right.
To elevate something from domestic violence to a RICO charge and racketeering.
And I just, you know, one of the questions just focused on, to some extent, this graphic video evidence from the hotel, and I think it's pretty obvious. The video is a central aspect of the prosecution's case, not just because it depicts him, Combs and Casey, in an altercation, but it's part of a bigger narrative, as I've just said, for the prosecution that Combs, in any instance to get individuals to comply with his criminal enterprise and with the conduct of the freak-offs, would use violence. Yeah. And this plays into the prosecution's narrative. It's a difficult case for the defense.
Yeah, given the videos and, I mean, settlements that have already taken place. Now, you know, Combs is facing not just criminal charges right now, but he's also facing 2 dozen lawsuits, civil lawsuits, some of which are settled already.
Look, at the end of the day, I mean, he had vast resources, and that's dwindling away because the government has also gone after assets. Leaving aside the civil cases, the evidence is extremely compelling. The way, again, this is something I talk about with the United States. The case is notorious. It's gotten exceptionally high media attention, of course, because you're dealing with, a cultural icon, an artist who had affiliations with many other, significantly known artists. The nature of the allegations are incredibly graphic, incredibly salacious.
And numerous.
And numerous. And in the United States, these cases play out well before a trial in the media. And then when you release the indictments and they're unsealed for the media to get a hold of, they're circulated throughout the media, both social media and regular media, and everybody will know about it. And as we've said, these are narratives. These are, persuasive narratives that are written as indictments. It's difficult. And then when you have this video evidence right at the beginning, which is incredibly emotive because of the violence that's exhibited, you're going to naturally, as a juror, have some sort of not only sympathy for the witness who's testifying, but you're going to be accepting evidence simply because there's this incredible violence that you're witnessing. It has a incredibly powerful effect.
Yeah, the hotel video is really compelling in terms of a single snapshot of the type of violence that took place. And, it's got to have some impact on how the jury receives the other information.
That's correct.
And
that will be a lens through which
propensity evidence.
That will be I mean, this is just full of bad character evidence every which way from Sunday. Yeah. But that will be the lens through which the jury, I think, now will, take in all the other evidence that's been called and will be called. And in cross-examination, we'll focus on certain inconsistencies, things not disclosed, but it's a challenging case. So hopefully we addressed some of the issues that somebody raised with us. So, we've got the indictment. It's different than the way we do things in Canada, but the case is going to, unfold. We can certainly make some comments about it, but hopefully we've addressed it. We got quite a bit of interest in. Can you just give us a comparison and talk about this case? So we tried.
And it's not a situation of saying like, is P. Diddy a good guy or a bad guy? It's like really what we're trying to focus on is
we're not trying to make a judgment on this.
What's the difference between what he's already agreed to and settled with in civil claims versus what he's charged with, and what are the duties of the prosecutor in order to prove their case?
Yeah, and there was one question I think about. Just leave aside the civil actions, because people can settle civil actions both in the United States and Canada for all sorts of reasons, especially when you're wealthy and you just want shit to go away. So leave those aside. This is a criminal prosecution based on evidence that has been called and being called on this indictment, and they're very serious allegations and there's compelling evidence. So that is what he's facing.
Well, and
we'll see when some other stuff come out.
What he's accused of kidnapping and arson and stuff. So we'll see what other complainants or witnesses are called, and we
can come back and revisit it. But there is real significance, and I guess I just want to draw this attention again. But the way we do things in Canada, you can have a very high-profile case here, but the public will know, far less about the evidence, far less about the potential witnesses until the trial, for good reason, and that is to maintain the fairness of the trial and to ensure you are able to impanel a jury that's impartial. And of course, we have virtually no screening, in my respectful opinion, of juries here.
It's also hard when the case is so publicized and high profile.
It is, but we do a much better job in Canada of having a fair process this way, because I do say, in many cases that reach a high profile in the United States, it is all over the media. Yeah. And everybody already knows what to expect, and it's difficult to overcome that.
I think it's fair to say that this case is going to be very emotional for a lot of people who are following it, because it does involve, domestic violence and
human trafficking is an incredible, insidious crime that's across the globe, and it's a very serious crime that is, it's there. I mean, there's a lot of it. So this is going to strike emotions, for people who have been victims of human trafficking, as well as those who've been, real victims of abuse. it's bad. It's a bad set of circumstances.
There's some concessions about domestic violence, and there's a lot of evidence that's been publicly made available. I think the question is, how much are they going to prove, and why proving one thing doesn't mean he necessarily would be convicted of everything else. But we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I think it's not going to go well. Anyways, if you,
I don't think so either.
So hopefully we address this in some interesting format for those who are interested in this.
Yep.
Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Send us your comments and questions, because like this, we do want to address comments and questions that we get. We'll do other ones that we think are interesting and important to talk about. But thank you very much for viewing, and we hope you have a lovely night.